This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
Funding for the Think podcast comes from Wise, an app for people using money around the globe. With the Wise account, you can send, spend, and receive in up to 40 currencies. You can download the Wise app or learn more at wise.com. Terms and conditions apply.
Parents are supposed to prioritize their child's emotional needs. But some parents are too wrapped up in their own stuff or in arguing with one another that they literally can't function as the grown-up in the room. And in those families, sometimes the child feels responsible for the parent's happiness instead of the other way around. From KERA in Dallas, this is Think. I'm Chris Boyd. My guest grew up with two parents who loved their daughter, but did not protect her from the turmoil of their relationship. They fought a lot, they would eventually divorce, but continued to live together for some time after that and would occasionally seem to be very deeply in love. Anna Konkle coped as a child by trying her best to soothe or distract their conflict, and as an adult, she poured some of that early confusion into comedy when she and her creative partner Maya Erskine created a comedy called PEN15, in which, as 30-something women, they each played versions of their real-life adolescent selves. The show ran for 2 much-praised seasons. You can still watch the whole thing on Hulu. But it only detailed some of Konkle's complicated relationship with her parents, especially her father, which continued to evolve for the rest of his life. She shares some of the rest in a compelling new memoir called The Sane One. Anna, welcome to Think.
Thank you for having me.
You share such an insightful diagnosis of why your parents' relationship was always complicated. Your dad approached a lot of situations with humor, and your mom, you describe her as naturally funny, but in an unintentional way. Talk about that.
Yeah, my dad and mom both connected in their sort of hippie days. And then there was this scurry towards sort of corporate America and more the white picket fence world. And in that, my dad was very funny, but in an inappropriate way. So he got fired a lot, which in itself is sort of funny to me. And my mom, on the other hand, is very earnest and an RN nurse, but also an energy worker and crystals and magnets and was comfortable going to the beat of her own drum. And so their dynamic was both kind of toxic but funny.
And you and your father bonded over jokes when you were young, sometimes at your mom's expense.
Yeah, that one I'm less proud of. Yeah, I think there was a natural connection with my dad. And, as a kid, you gravitate towards the person in the room that's smiling the most, I think, in simple terms, and that wants to laugh with you. And my mom, in retrospect, was really keeping the household going and my life going. But to me, I just saw a really stressed out, person that, made me nervous.
Do you think funny is made or born?
What a good question. I think it's both. I think, as someone, I now have a 5-year-old daughter, and I see myself in my mom often. Or, I'm doing an interview and someone says a joke, but I don't read the joke and I take it earnestly, and then we end up laughing about that later. Or, there's a sharpness to me sometimes, or I'll say something that I think is funny that's too dark for the rest of the people in the room. And I recognize both my father and my mother in the way that I see the world and what I think is funny about it. And I think some of it's DNA, and I think some of it's learned. Probably differs for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, there is a certain amount of risk taking required to be funny, right? You have to be willing to have somebody not quite read the joke or to say something that they, find offensive or inappropriate or whatever.
I think so. My favorite comedy is stuff that is inherently experimental, and it's sort of a funny time to be trying to um, sell a comedy. I live in LA, and that's a lot of the conversation around here these days is how do you make an old school comedy again? How do you make a big studio film that everyone goes to that's laugh out loud? And somehow it's this equation that people feel like it's hard to crack. But when I think of old Jim Carrey movies and we all rushed to the theater, they were Ace Ventura: Pet Detective is pretty experimental and it's in the concept, there's so much that used to be made that was really character driven.
You share in the book this scene from when you were on a road trip with your parents and there was an argument in the car over music, which is like the kind of thing that families might cheerfully bicker about. This one took a turn. And when you realized your mother had her feelings hurt, suddenly you felt like it was your job to smooth over the tension. How would you try to do that?
There was a lot of, turning up the sweetness or being extra polite or, kind of the checking in the rearview mirror of my parents' eyes, holding hands. There was sort of a feeling that I can see in retrospect of filling in emotionally as, their spouses individually. And that took me a really long time to sort of identify. And it was an uncomfortable idea to process as an adult, but it's something that has helped me as the years have gone by and something that I can identify a loss of childhood through being overly attentive to your parents' emotional needs when they're sort of breaking down is something that gave me pride at the time. As a kid, I was sort of like type A and precocious and got a lot of validation from being the kid that, was emotionally connecting to adults. But I don't think I realized that it came from a survival mechanism quite early on. I thought it was DNA. And then as I got older in my 20s and started therapy for the first time, started connecting the pieces that those parts of how I grew up were, not every family. And when that's all you kind of assume that that's what's happening behind all the closed doors and that nobody talks about it.
What really stunned me about that story was that you were 5 at the time. So you were perceiving these things from, it sounds like, the earliest time that you have memories. In some ways, developing that, and I don't mean to minimize the emotional toll this would take, but I wonder if developing that sensitivity to what everybody in the room is thinking and feeling is helpful for an actor and a writer.
I mean, yeah, that's really interesting. My mom has come such a long way emotionally from where our relationship was and as a child, it's when I was a child and how she coped with her feelings. And we have a pretty good relationship now. And she's kind of the sunny side of her is almost always out. And my partner, Alex, we've been together for 12 years, saw her one night after my dad died. We got in a fight and he was like, "Your mother is Meryl Streep," because he's an actor too. And he was watching her. He was sort of, first he was protective of me and, wanted to make sure we were okay. But second came the sort of fascination of her emotional, I don't want to say swings, but how she can move in her emotions quickly. And it can sort of go from curiosity to, she feels things so deeply. And, and that is a part of why I'm an actor. I think my mom had her own trauma growing up. And I think the earlier you experience sadness, consistently, fear, for better or for worse, the more probably connected you are, or in our family, to those feelings.
I mean, there are a couple of different ways to go with that if you're surrounded by people who have very big feelings that they don't typically try to minimize. Like, you can be every bit that dramatic in your interactions with other people, or you can feel like it's your job to be the one who is always on an even keel. Did you feel with your parents like you couldn't ever be the dramatic one?
I slowly went into being the dramatic one, I would say, but it wasn't a place that I felt invited to for a long time. And that sort of brings in the title of the book, which is the sane one, of feeling like that, that was my job, was, and in a funny way too, of like, and devastating, but to say, I'm the one that can see mom's intention here behind the screaming or the crying. And I know that dad's a good guy. And if I can just remind them who they are, then, they'll fall in love again and things will be okay. And, when that didn't work, eventually in my teen years, there was anger that came out, and it's in Pen 15 a little bit, those kind of, but more comedic versions, the fights with my mom, and eventually going to college. The intention was, I'm moving to New York City and I'm going to be nothing like you guys. And the surprise was, I had packed, my baggage was with me in New York, and I didn't leave it behind. And that's been sort of a lifelong quest since.
I think delusions of grandeur is way too harsh and judgmental a term, but we'll say your dad had kind of unrealized dreams about a big life, possibly a career in entertainment. When you got interested in acting as a kid, he was right there for it. Is that right?
Yeah, he would bring me to commercial auditions in Boston that a casting director invited me to after seeing me, and I'm sure, a mediocre performance in a Presbyterian church. But still, I got the invite, and he would go with me, and we were sort of living his dream together, I think, in some ways.
And at one point, he started musing to you that maybe he would start auditioning for commercials. How did you feel about that at the time?
I half and half. I always had this feeling of, he was my dad. He's magical to me, and I half agreed when he'd be like, I could be this, I could be a DJ, I could, be a professional singer, I could whatever. As a young kid, I think part of the beauty and the humor is looking at your parent, and whatever they say they can do, you believe they can do it, but as I got older, yeah, there started to be this sense of like, okay, can I just be my own person? Can I have my own thing? And that has been an interesting walk of trying to separate myself from them, and not realizing that when you begin at a young age trying, so focused on your parents' needs, that's your codependence, and you kind of see yourself as a version of them or as a part of them. And I wrote later in the book about having my own child, and it took me a moment to realize I was overcorrecting from not having boundaries when I was a kid and trying to give her boundaries, but she had just been born. I was like, where does she want to be? Like, how tight does she want to be held? I don't want to need comfort from her. I want to just give it to her. And then eventually sort of came to terms with the idea, like, she was just inside me, and right now she thinks we are the same person, and that's intentional. That's beautiful. And when she, can speak and wants and asks for space, or I'll sense her boundaries even before that, and move forward. But it definitely led to, like, the opposite extreme, real hypervigilance of how I wanted to parent differently.
Anna, so many memories of your time with your parents when you were young, with them not getting along. And then at one point they send you off to camp and you come back and they seem to be super happy together.
Yeah. Yeah, that was very surreal. I remember leaving for camp and them fighting the whole way. The car, for whatever reason, was a major point of tension for them and for my mom and I whenever we were driving, really. And yeah, I and she had said recently, like weeks before I left, after my dad had left one night, like I can't do this much longer. I'm gonna need a divorce or something. And I had taken that with me on my camp trip. And what I didn't expect, I remember like breaking down with some of the kids in the cabin and sort of telling everybody. And then I got this postcard one night or one day, and it was from them, and they were in Boston and they were staying at a hotel, which they never did. I mean, we did not spend money really. And my mom kind of wrote that they were in love again and that they couldn't wait to see me. And there was both this major, obviously feeling, or if it's not obvious, major feeling of relief and excitement and joy. I mean, I had really never heard them talk like this, except nostalgically in a way that, when they first met before I was born. And so, but there was also a feeling of being in the way
Mm.
that sort of occurred to me. And it would repeat after that a few times.
When you were in seventh grade, they did sit you down and say they were getting a divorce, which is like a hugely hard thing for any kid who lives through it at any age. It was really confusing for you because neither one of them wanted to move out right away.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't know that at first when they told me about the divorce. We lived at a very Irish Catholic town and in Massachusetts, and I didn't know anybody that had gone through that. So there wasn't a blueprint in my mind, but I assumed I knew at least if you're divorced, you're not living together. But the confusion began the moment they told me, where I have this really vivid memory, to the extent where I can see the light in the room and, my dad's hands, and where my mom says the words divorce. And then I say, well, is it going to be a separation first? My dad started to shake his head, yes. And my mom said no. And so there was this feeling of him sort of holding out hope that this wasn't really the direction it was going in. And my mom saying, no, this is a divorce. It's happening. And him seeing that and kind of freezing up and almost feeling like he stayed frozen after that. And then the house was split in two, and at first it continued to be the same confusing walk in a way that I had experienced for the first 13 years of my life, where there was this designated room for my dad downstairs, and my mom had her room upstairs, and we shared the kitchen. But then, there were nights where I thought maybe they were getting back together because, they were sharing the same room or whatever. And that was, similar, like feeling of, maybe this is going to work out. At the same time, as I got older, I started to understand that divorce started to become more appealing, especially at the end of the 2 years of splitting the house in half. I was like, well, what about the divorce? And they were going to court at the time, deciding who would get the house. But I think underneath that was a resistance in letting each other go, and a codependence that they had. They would always say, we're still a family. And over time, I really resented that. And as a teenager, would be like, no, we're not. Let's stop. We're in a good way. Let's move past that. But that took a bit of time for me to get there.
When it was ultimately your dad who moved out and you stayed mostly in the house with your mom, you would occasionally take advantage of the fact that they wouldn't communicate to each other necessarily. So like you could say you were at mom's house or at dad's house, and you would just get out and do whatever you wanted to do. I mean, did you love that freedom at the time, or did you think no one is looking out for me?
Wow. Yeah, I liked it. I was so as a, I have a half brother who's 11 years older, same mom, but we didn't grow up in the same house. And so even though there was this constant distraction of my parents and their relationship, and focus on each other, I also felt really relied upon. And, the expectations were always there for me to sort of be the perfect student or, rise to any occasion. And so there was a relief in the distraction and, and dad having a work thing or going to a casino and my mom going to a silent retreat or whatever it was, and getting to be a teenager, getting to break rules, getting to rebel. I think my attempt at a pristine, perfect daughter role was breaking apart, and I was ready to try to break rules, I guess. And so I did when they both went away, and I had a party that went poorly.
I feel like I'm a work in progress with my personal style, but lately I've tried to choose things that are classic and well made and not trendy, but just work in a lot of different combinations. Quince is a great place to start for clothes like this. The fabrics are elevated, the fits are flattering, everything just sort of works without having to overthink it. Quince makes it easy to refresh your everyday look this spring with pieces that feel as good as they look. They use a lot of premium materials like European linen and organic cotton and ultra soft denim. They have lightweight linen pants and dresses and tops starting at $30 that are breathable and easy to wear on repeat. I was super excited because I needed a new handbag for the summer, and I went on the website and found a diamond-stitched sling bag that is currently winging its way to me. I'm very excited to receive it. Everything at Quince is priced like 50 to 80% less than similar brands because they work with ethical factories and they cut out the middlemen, so customers are paying for quality and craftsmanship rather than brand markup. I like the things at Quince that are made out of silk, which are almost always washable. They feel amazing on the skin, and they really are a lot less expensive than similar items elsewhere. Refresh your everyday with luxury you will actually use. Head to quince.com/KERA for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada as well. That is quince, QUINCE.com/KERA for free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/KERA.
This show is supported by Odoo. When you buy business software from lots of vendors, the costs add up and it gets complicated and confusing. Odoo solves this. It's a single company that sells a suite of enterprise apps that handles everything from accounting to inventory to sales. Odoo is all connected on a single platform in a simple and affordable way. You can save money without missing out on the features you need. Check out Odoo at odoo.com. That's odoo.com.
Did you get really good at compartmentalizing? Like, home could be stressful, dealing with either one of your parents or both of them could be stressful, but then you wanted to go to school and, be pretty and popular and whatever. Were you able to, like, shut off one set of feelings to go engage in a different part of your life?
Yeah, I thought that was a skill for a long time, and it took me, till maybe 5 years ago or something like that to realize that it wasn't a quality that I wanted to keep continuing on. But yeah, I mean, I remember, uh, you know, getting in arguments with my mom and it feeling like the end of the world and accruing so much anger and shame as the years went on with the sort of dysfunction behind closed doors. And the car door would open and I'd see someone see me and the smile would go on and, wipe the tears while smiling. They'll think I'm just scratching my face, and walking in and assuming the role of sort of just this dual side of me. It's like it wasn't totally fake. I sort of did walk to the beat of my own drum as well, as a teenager. Um, but I was not honest about what was happening at home. And I think a lot of people, with dysfunctional home lives fall into that. There's not really a great outlet to say, God, my parents are, out of control today or whatever. Although I did find my way to the guidance counselor's office. Um, so that was a constant outlet for me. I was like always knocking on their doors. So at least there was that.
Was that helpful? Did you feel like you could lay it all out for them?
I didn't have the insight that I kind of gained in my 20s of the level of um, damage that was happening to my psyche, I think, at that age. But relying on another adult to just tell my secrets to and to feel that it wasn't an imposition was massive. And there have been so many, and this is going to make me emotional, grown-ups that showed up in my life through my childhood, through college, even, that gave me a safe space to be a kid, to be a teen, to be messy, to cry, to be silly and crazy and, have a party, whatever. Like there was space made for me consistently um, by adults. And that's been important for me to try to pass on in my own adult life in different ways. So,
So,
yeah,
like
I'm very thankful for that.
people who could see through what you thought was a completely opaque front.
Yeah, I think to kids around me, I was not comfortable sharing what was happening at home, but to the guidance counselor, it was like, well, that's their job. This is this is appropriate. I'm going to tell them. Um, it felt like I was such a rule follower, so it felt like there were social rules. There were rules everywhere. So uh, I guess the guidance counselors were a way of following a rule. This was an appropriate place to share my inner thoughts. And I think to other adults in my life, like my best friend's parents, the McGowans, they I wasn't telling them every detail of what was happening. I don't think I shared specifically most things, but they showed up for me. They were there. They included me in their dinners. They, you know, made me breakfast and called me their second daughter and gave me a quiet, safe place to call home without feeling like an imposition when I needed it. And that was plenty for me to hang on to keep growing in the right direction, I think.
I have to tell you, Anna, I remember reading about Pen 15 around the time it was released and thinking, this cannot possibly work. Although it remains today one of my favorite shows ever. For people who maybe will just discover it for the first time after hearing this conversation, will you just explain the premise?
Yes. And by the way, it makes total sense why you're like, that will not work. Um, yeah. So the show takes place in year 2000. It is about two 13-year-old rejects who are best friends in middle school trying to survive every day. And the way they do is basically through each other. Um, and it was such a surreal experience getting to make it. I still can't believe we got to.
So,
And we play the 13-year-olds.
right,
I
right.
guess that's a really important part, surrounded by real 13-year-olds. And it's the R-rated version of how middle school really was in our minds.
I thought that was the most brilliant thing that you and Maya Erskine played 13-year-olds as women in your early 30s, but everybody else around you was spot on the same age. Did you go back and forth, or did you always know it would be everybody else would actually be a kid?
That's a great question. We did go back and forth. We knew that, we wanted to play the 13-year-olds, the main two. We knew that, or rather that we wanted adults to, even if they needed to recast us with celebrities, that would have been fine. But the passion was two adults need to play these 13-year-olds so that we can tell the real experience of being 13. It's not the Nickelodeon version. It's not we have these, treasure troves of stories that we can't tell. There's not a conduit to appropriately tell them. And then we talked about kind of surrounding us with a mix of real 13-year-olds and other adults playing 13. But as the years went on and the development went on, we landed into this really clean space that the metaphor was us in our 30s being stuck in some ways psychically as 13-year-old rejects, and we are in limbo in year 2000, and can't move on, So it was cleaner just to follow that through and let us just live in a memory.
I mean, everybody's memories of middle school are cringe-inducing, but I take issue with, characterizing the show as cringe comedy, because I feel like that term implies a kind of meanness that the show at its core did not have. So I wonder about your relationship to the term cringe.
At first I was surprised when I saw it. A ton of press came out calling it a cringe comedy. And I don't even think I had heard that term before. Someone, I want to say it was the New York Times, someone called it a traumedy, and that felt right.
Mm-hmm.
I think the cringe reference makes me sad because it was the most honest rendering we could make of that time. And there was this reckoning constantly in the writer's room with wanting to tell, this other story that we hadn't seen told about being a girl and trying, to grow up. And it would feel wrong, it would be in the writer's room and I'd be like, oh, this feels embarrassing to say this pitch, but, I'm going to say it. And then I would get angry that the same pitch we've seen in, comedies since I was 13, but about boys. And so it was this feeling over and over that we didn't go in with, like, it wasn't a feminist quest to write this in the beginning. And then in the writer's room, it became, oh, and that subject about girls is off the table, and that one. Okay, that one too. And then slowly started to really have to reckon with the fact that people were not comfortable hearing the truth about girls, and that a best friendship couldn't be between women, or girls couldn't be the central engine for something. So those things started to upset me. So I think that the cringe reference was another, continuation of me feeling like, oh, okay, to see our truth, to hold up a mirror to, what's real is cringy. And that makes me sad. And these days, like, earnestness and feels in short supply. And with this younger generation, I worry, that to be too authentic or too earnest is gross. And I think at the same time, I think it's the opposite,
Anna, how did working on PEN15, I mean, in some ways it's like the classic therapy, exercise of like taking something that really happened and then imagining how it could have played out differently. Did the show function that way for you at all? Or did you so thoroughly feel like Anna Cohn, the character you created, was something apart from Anna Konkle, the human woman?
Mm-hmm. Anna Cohn is not how I was exactly in middle school. And I feel like I get some passive aggressive comments from kids that I did go to middle school with. But she was a little bit more like I was in elementary school. And she's me to my most authentic self. If I'm not posing at all, if I'm, not aware of how to blend in, or it was a very freeing character to get to play, and in some ways a more honest version of myself, I think.
Was there something about doing this series that put you in the headspace that made it possible to write this memoir, which delves into things that are darker than what could be covered in a comedy?
Yeah, I mean, I got the question a lot in interviews during PEN15 if my parents' relationship in the show was true to life. And the answer was always yes, but there's so much more. And, the first season of making PEN15, I was sort of at the tail end of an estrangement with my father. And we went for about 5 years without seeing each other. And I'm, acting and writing with my TV dad and intentionally conjuring these memories of him and of my mom, but they are the TV versions. They are funnier, they are lighter. There is, even though we really avoided saccharine endings, it was, every episode was a little bit more saccharine than clearly what my real life was, and definitely with them. Whatever it was, the estrangement time with my dad and everything leading up to it left me feeling quite isolated. And I don't like the feeling of secrets. I mean, who does? Um, and having a secret makes me want to write.
Mm.
And that was where I would characterize my relationship with my dad at that point, like quite private, you know?
I think what's so remarkable about this memoir is that you share these questions that you struggled with in a way that was very much alone. It was sort of kicked off by there was a party, a cast party, I guess, that your father attended after a performance of yours. And you learned from some friends in passing that as your dad
Mhm.
was leaving, he kissed them on the lips.
Hmm. Yeah, he tried. Yeah, that was his greeting. Hello, I learned was from two coworkers who I loved, were dear friends that I worked with at a restaurant. I was probably 23, 24, somewhere around there. And they were probably more like 30. And they were really sweet and sort of laughing it off of, oh my God, I met your dad. He's so funny. And he kind of tried to kiss me on the lips. And I was, of course, mortified. Um, and was like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. You okay? And they were both like, oh my God, we would have mentioned it to upset you. It's fine. Like, what an eccentric guy. Just really overly kind about it. And I froze in part because in recent years, in my adult years, my memory was not that that's how we ever greeted each other when I was a kid. Because culturally, that's, true for some families, and there's a comfort there. But I I don't recall us having greeted with a kiss on the lips. And yet in my adult years, that's what was happening. And I would turn my face sort of so it was the cheek, and I would eventually tell him, like, I don't like that. Can you stop doing that? Which was like really awkward
Hmm.
to tell your father. And I knew that he was changing. There were things I was seeing in his behavior, and that was different. And it was a feeling of losing him. And it had been that feeling for years.
You asked your mom about it, which has to have been, taken a certain amount of courage because I guess, were still in contact but had been divorced for some time. What did you think your mom might be able to tell you about whether inappropriate things had occurred in your own childhood?
She was most, I mean, I don't know what I expected. I think there was a part of me having this like beautiful mind-esque crisis, and connecting all of the dots of my childhood, and realizing how uncomfortable I was in my body with my own sexuality, that romantically I had sort of these fantasies of how I wanted to be and live. And my relationship with, men that I liked was sort of, I was comfortable in the romance ideas, but less in my body. And so I had this sort of realization of that, and then this fear of there being some sort of sexual abuse in my past, tied in with realizing that my father had had estrangements with a lot of people in his family, including my brother and my half brother, 11 years older. And so, yeah, I had this rolling panic that would take years to sift through, where in a heap after a huge fight with my father, I called my mom on a Florida bench, um, and asked her if she thinks that I was abused. And she basically said no, but there was this acknowledgement of, you know, kind of thinking back into her head with me and going, well, your dad he was weird. And I can laugh at that because I have, that's my relationship with humor and sadness is you laugh or cry sometimes. I mean, I was absolutely devastated in that moment. Certainly wasn't laughing. But it sort of opened up this really difficult time in my life of facing what I would understand later as PTSD and um, from a really loud childhood and from not feeling in many ways that I really had boundaries that were respected as a kid.
You brought your father back into your life when he was dealing with a recurrence of cancer. How did you try to set boundaries at that point that would make some kind of resumption of the relationship possible, especially in this moment where he ultimately was quite needy?
Oh, such a good question. I think about that a lot now. I, we had begun, really, I had been writing letters to him over probably almost 5 years that I didn't send. It took me a long time to write one where I asked him all the questions that I wanted to ask about childhood and the moments that I felt not respected, while understanding that he could respond in any way, that he could say, you're crazy, or God forbid, yes, this happened and it's your fault. What did I need to say to him so that I was more healed after I sent the letter, no matter what his response would be? And I happened to get a letter back where he kind of detailed affirmations of my experience while also dispelling worries, which was new. I mean, my experience of him in years earlier was, blame, 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 and defend, defend, defend. And that was sort of the whole MO. And so this marked a change, although I didn't know how authentic it was. And so there was like a slow dipping of the toe into a relationship again with him. And, a real interesting moment for me was the first time I was, I mean, there were only a couple times, but that I went to the Emmys and I wanted to FaceTime him. I mean, I don't think I had FaceTimed him in years. And I FaceTimed him from the auditorium. And before we walked into the auditorium, rather, and it was an authentic moment and want for whatever that, means to, it meant a lot to me then that I felt that way, that I actually wanted to talk to him because I had spent a while going like, I only feel worthy to you if I'm accomplishing something, if I'm furthering your dreams or if I'm perfect or whatever. And so the fact that I want to share that moment with him felt significant. And then it was a few weeks later. Oh no, it was the next morning that he called me and I was on the way to the writer's room and he told me that he had lung cancer. And he had known for a couple months. Um, and I believe that was later than when he wrote me the letter back, but who knows? And we both cried. And he had had cancer before, but this time the way he expressed it and the kind of cancer was different, even though he didn't know the stage. Um, and I went back to Florida that weekend with my partner, Alex. We'd been together at this point for 7, 8 years. And back to the, the scene of where I had left. And he opened the door and greeted us and told me he had pneumonia, which obviously was like concerning. because pneumonia looks a lot like lung cancer to me when he opened the door. And long story short, I wanted him to go to the hospital. He was in a lot of pain when he opened the door, and he wouldn't. And he didn't go until 4 a.m. that night, and he woke us up and basically said, later made a joke that he didn't want us to find him, dead in the other room because it would have ruined our pool vacation. That's sort of just how he moved. And so, yeah, we ended up in the hospital that night, and it was in some ways feeling or worried about being back in the net of intimacy and caring for him. But there was an understanding that I had taken space without asking for years, and that I was choosing to be here. And I think also there was this realization that he was someone to look up to in the way that he was dealing with this cancer and dealing with facing what was becoming more and more obvious was going to be the end. He was given 1 to 5 years, and it was a race trying to get us to that. It ended up being 2 months. And so something I'm thankful for is there was this very different way of looking up to him than I'd felt before, which was not the dominating, patriarchal figure telling us what to do. It was this, in some ways, atrophying man who was soft and philosophical and jamming to music on morphine and poetic and funny and facing the music. I mean, he really wasn't turning away from the end. He maybe was turning away from the symptoms or treatment, but he was really looking at the end in a way that I could look up to. And there was a deep closeness between us emerging, but it also was so separate. He was literally going into a different space, a different plane, while I was staying here on Earth. And it was different, and it was together and apart, and I needed that.
Anna Konkle is an actor, writer, and director. She co-created and co-starred on the Hulu series PEN15. Her memoir is titled The Sane One. Anna, thank you so much for the conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Think is distributed by PRX, the Public Radio Exchange. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, anywhere you get podcasts, and at think.kera.org. Again, I'm Chris Boyd. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.